If the natural tendencies of mankind are so bad that it is not safe to permit people to be free, how is it that the tendencies of these organizers are always good? Do not the legislators and their appointed agents also belong to the human race, or do they believe that they themselves are made of a finer clay than the rest of mankind? Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Today I have Dr. Abby Hall Blanco. She is a Ph.D. at Bellarmine University in the Rebel School, or the Ruble School, I'm sorry. She is the co-author of Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism and Manufacturing Terrorism, U.S. Government Propaganda in the War on Terror. Ms. Hall, where is the best place to find your collection of research?
So people can find me on my website. It's AbigailRHall.com. There you'll find links to both books as well as my CV, so people can find papers. They can also find links to all of my relevant social media accounts as well.
All of those links will be in the description below. Ms. Hall, what is economics?
So economics kind of depends on who you talk to in terms of what it is that we study. So oftentimes when we talk to our principal students, we talk about economics as the study of how to allocate scarce resources. So the idea behind that is that there exists scarcity. So we have a limited number of resources, but a potentially infinite number of things that we could do with those resources. And so as a result, we have to make decisions about how to allocate those resources. Lots of interesting things fall out of that. So thinking about things like competition. So there's always going to be competition for resources. And then we think about allocation mechanisms. So how do we go about coming up with different institutions to allocate those resources? So we can think about things like markets, we can think about things like government allocation and so on. But more broadly speaking, economics is really about exchange. So oftentimes if you take like a principles of economics class, you see like those supply and demand curves that we like to write up on the board a whole lot. And there's that equilibrium point. But what a lot of people don't realize is that that's really, it's a model, it's a simplification. And that equilibrium point is what people tend to focus on, but it actually really gets away kind of from what economics is all about, which is which are those exchange processes that occur. So how it is that people go about exchanging with one another, and then also to examining those institutional structures in which people exchange. So taking that definition of economics, or that conceptualization of economics, economics applies then very broadly to all kinds of human behavior, from things that are very, very mundane. So thinking about, people buying and selling apples or something like that, from things that are really, really complex and people might think are not necessarily within the purview of economics, things like defense and foreign intervention, which is the stuff that I'm interested in. So bringing an economic understanding to those types of issues as well.
How can the average person benefit from learning the basics of economics?
So the plug, or the answer to that question that I offer to my students, because I recognize that most people aren't planning to go pro, if you will, in economics. Not everybody wants to go out and get a PhD, for instance, which is probably good because we want people to be diverse in the things that they study. And I also just selfishly would really like the job security, and everybody had a PhD in economics. That wouldn't be good for that. So why then should everybody, or why would I argue that people should study economics? Simply put, economics helps us understand the world around us in a way that I think other disciplines do not. Doesn't necessarily mean that those other disciplines aren't worth studying. In fact, I'd say they absolutely are. I had a professor in graduate school, Pete Becky, who would put it like this: economics is like a set of eyeglasses. And when you put on a set of glasses, if you have ever worn glasses or contacts, you know that it brings things into focus. Economics as an analytical framework helps us to see things in a way that we otherwise would not. So in particular, from understanding things from the perspective like, what incentives do people face? And then understanding those incentives, we can then look and understand, well, this is why this policy maybe works this way or doesn't work this way. Economics provides us a really powerful tool for understanding our own behavior, the behavior of the individuals that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, but also then understanding the behavior, the policies, and the implications of the policies that are being implemented in the world around us, whether that's at a local level, a national level, or an international level. So it's really helpful in a number of contexts to understand exactly what it is that we see day to day in history, but also then too what we're likely to see in the future.
Henry Hazlitt wrote a book, Economics in One Lesson. He said, "The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups." Do you think this gets to the heart of economics, or is it missing something?
So I love Henry Hazlitt's book. It's in fact one of the books that I recommend when people are asking if there's one book that they could read to start thinking about economics. It's usually at the very top of the list. So I think that Hazlitt really hits the nail on the head there. And what he's talking about in terms of not just looking at the immediate effects, but looking at the long-term effects is something that economics does very, very well. Another individual that people often talk about, this idea of seen and unseen, is Frederick Bastiat. So one of the things that I really like about economics, and as we actually start our semester here this week, I'll be doing a couple of lectures with students to illustrate this particular point. We don't just want to look at, as economists, these surface level implications of a particular policy, but we want to look at and see, well, what are the unintended consequences? So things that are related to some initial policy or action, but we might not be able to necessarily trace out immediately. And so I think Hazlitt does a really nice job of kind of summarizing what it is that as economists we're looking to do.
So I'd like you to sort of show us how you would sort of walk through your way of thinking if you were trying to show us how to engage in the economic approach of thinking. So as opposed to, citing statistics at this point in the discussion, just show us the sort of methods you would use for these various topics. Let's start with, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so let's say I look out and I see the great deal, let's just deal with America. I see much more poverty than is clearly desirable. Any amount is horrible. I want a country with higher wages. How could I use the economic way of thinking to decide how I could live in a country that has higher wages?
So there are a couple different things that we can think of. So the way that I always put it to my students is thinking about things in terms of like a means ends framework. So what do I mean by that? So when we say ends, we're talking about goals. That's another word that we could use. And then when we say means, we simply mean action. So we think about that oftentimes within the context of policies. So what policies are we going to undertake to try to achieve a particular goal? As economists, we're focused not so much on what the goal is. So we take the goal or the ends as given, but instead we're focusing on the means. So when we analyze a particular policy, and so in the case of poverty alleviation, like you just mentioned, we could think of a couple of different policies that we might try to implement in order to achieve something like higher wages. So one policy that people frequently suggest is increasing the minimum wage, which again, sounds relatively straightforward. You're like, well, okay, like if we want higher wages, just make employers pay everyone more. And this seems like a straightforward policy. And certainly you would look and see that if it was mandated that employers had to pay, say, $15 or $20 an hour, that workers would be paid $15 or $20 an hour. But that's a surface level analysis. What that misses is a variety of other unintended consequences of something like a minimum wage policy. So I would come back to something like that and say, okay, well, who is still employed and who is not employed? And so then you start to consider things like, well, what are disemployment effects? So we would see, for instance, thinking about it from a standard like supply and demand type of narrative, if I offer or I require that employers pay everybody, say $20 an hour, more people are going to want to work for $20 an hour. But fewer employers are going to be willing or able to pay people $20 an hour to work. So this would mean that we'd be likely to see a surplus of labor in economic parlance, higher rates of unemployment. And those are likely to be higher for particular groups, particularly people who don't have what we would say a $20 per hour skill set. They're just not productive enough to command that high of a wage. We also see effects related to that, things like people who are really young. So again, people who don't typically have enough skills to command that type of a wage. You'd also see other types of effects or things that we could look at, things like number of hours worked that would get reduced. Working conditions tend not to be as great. Other types of benefits, so things like vacation, paid sick days, and so on, those types of benefits also tend to be reduced when we talk about these types of policies. So that's one particular example that we could use. Or we could look at alternative policies, so things looking like maybe investments in education programs or building up what economists refer to as human capital, or other types of like physical capital investments. And we could do a similar analysis with those things as well, recognizing that every policy that we might implement has potential upsides, but also potential downside as well.
Why are some countries wealthy and others impoverished?
It's a great question, and one that has been asked by economists quite literally since economics was a thing. So Adam Smith in 1776 wrote the book An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And in case that's too much of a mouthful, people often just say the wealth of nations, understandably so. And he asks a very similar question. Why are some countries rich and other countries poor? This is a question of development economics, even still. And the short version is we have an idea of what makes certain countries wealthy. So Adam Smith narrowed it down, like basically you've got strong like private protection of like institutions like private property rights, stable rule of law, and easy taxes. And that's a pretty good summary, what Adam Smith talked about. And we have that idea. We know that those countries who possess those characteristics tend to be wealthier than countries that don't, and it's easy to see why. So if you're worried about your private property, or you don't have private property at all, for instance, you're probably not going to be doing a lot of investing, for example. The interesting question, or the thing that comes out of that, is how do we go from being a poor country to being a rich country? Or even in some cases, how do you go from being a relatively wealthy country to a relatively poor country? And can you take those types of institutions that wealthy countries have, and can you implement those institutions, or can you export those institutions into places where they don't exist? And that's a really interesting question, and one that development economists in particular have been looking to tackle for a very long time.
Let's say I clearly see there's, something like, tens of millions of Americans who do not have reliable health coverage. Now, very often the discussions focus around health insurance costs. Well, then maybe you could take a step back and say, well, it's only high because medical costs are so high. Why is healthcare so expensive?
So not a health economist, so somebody who is more well-versed in this particular topic could probably give you a much more nuanced answer than the one that I am going to give. But the United States, like our health insurance, or the way that we have provided healthcare is weird. So basically you get our current health insurance system, starts in the believe in like the war period, where you have this restriction on what employers could pay their workers. And so then employers started offering to pay for health insurance as like a benefit, as a way to offset the fact they couldn't offer higher wages. And so then you start to have this system where now people have this expectation that their employers are paying for their health care. You also within this have a ton of regulation in the healthcare arena. So now you've got this quote unquote market where nobody really knows the prices for anything. So like if I went to, my primary care physician a couple weeks ago for a physical exam, I have no idea how much it costs. Where there's very, very little or no other markets that I can really think of where I don't have any idea of what it's going to cost. And then you get your itemized bill and it charges you something absurd, but then your insurance company says what they're going to pay, what they're not going to pay. So in terms of why health insurance is, or why healthcare is so incredibly expensive, it's because the market has been incredibly distorted over the course of decades and decades and decades. It's remarkably non-competitive. And just frankly, the amount of government intervention has just scrambled those price signals so much that now, again, people can't make heads or tails of them.
And do you have a theory as to why things like printers and cell phones and computers and televisions have drastically decreased in price while increasing in quality in, I mean, certainly the last 20 years?
So there's a really interesting, and people can look up these graphics to see what things have gotten more expensive and what things have gotten cheaper. So people see things like healthcare has gotten a lot more expensive, or college tuition has gotten a lot more expensive. And yet, as you point out, things like televisions or phones or electronics have gotten a lot less expensive. So we can look at things like competition as driving down prices. And also, too, technologies tend to be relatively expensive when they're first introduced, again, partially owing to competition. So who's making them? People get better at making them. There's more competition. This drives down the price of those particular items. But then if you look at things like healthcare, you look at things like education, you see a couple different themes. Things, for instance, like lots of government regulation, but then also, too, especially within the case of something like higher education, you see things like lots and lots of government subsidies. So when governments subsidize things, those things tend to get a lot more expensive.
And why is that?
So when you subsidize something, again, I'll use the case of higher education as a great example. So the purpose of the subsidy is for government to try to get individuals to consume more of something and for producers to make more of something. So you can think about it as like a reverse tax. So the way that government does this, again, through a subsidy, is essentially the group or the individuals selling the product are going to receive more for making that product, so that it provides them an incentive to make more. But then the people consuming it through the subsidy are also going to pay less. So thinking about it from standard economics, when the cost of something, or the price of something, I should say, falls, people consume more of that particular good or service. Higher ed, not an exception to this rule. But what happens when you subsidize something? From the perspective of, again, say a college, you don't really have much of an incentive to do something like cost conserve, because you know that government's trying to push people into going and getting a college education, which again, isn't necessarily a bad thing. We know that people who are highly educated, they earn more, their communities are wealthier, their children do better, and so on. So not saying that it's a bad goal, and we take the goals as given, but when you know that you have that steady stream of income, now you've got to start doing things like competing for students on like other margins. So you start seeing things like really big athletic centers being set up, or this is true, like maybe you set up like an oxygen bar or something like that during finals week to try to make things more, pleasurable for students, like during times where like it's really high stress. And all of these types of things increase cost. You also have issues related to things like administrative bloat. But again, a lot of these things are driven by the fact that you have government that's subsidizing this particular commodity. And this has a bunch of downward effects as well, going to what we were talking about earlier, like unintended consequences. See all the things related to student debt and so on that people now really, really care about, which are all directly tied to this really heavy subsidization of higher ed.
When someone says that they see, the healthcare market's very difficult to get around, a lot of these utilities are very difficult to be interested in, you know what? I think it should all be free. They will literally stop the conversation at there and say that their belief, as opposed to the greedy Abby Halls of the world who want us to have to pay for things and believe in scarcity, they're so kind that they believe everything should be free. How do you begin to tap into that mindset of free? There's two things. We could either pay for them or they could be free.
So the economist Milton Friedman said there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So sometimes you hear that abbreviated in the absolute monstrosity of Tanstoffel. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but there is no such thing as free. So somebody is always paying for something. And this is a really important, really basic economic concept. In fact, it's so basic, we go over it in our Econ 110. So second day of principles after we do the syllabus, we cover this topic. It's what's called opportunity cost. So when economists talk about cost, we frame it in this particular way. So what we basically mean is that whenever we make a choice, we necessarily don't get to do something else. So if I go and I spend, say, $5 on a hamburger, I necessarily cannot take that same $5 and spend it on a couple pieces of pizza. So if I choose to buy the hamburger, then the opportunity cost, or that next best alternative that I give up, the pizza, I have to forego it. So when we talk about things being quote unquote free, we don't mean that those opportunity costs go away. We might mean, so when somebody says free, for instance, they really just mean that it should be zero price for somebody who is consuming it. But that doesn't mean that we suddenly suspend reality and we get rid of that underlying scarcity. Somebody is still paying for it. It may not be the person who is receiving the good, or it may not be the person who's receiving the good, at least directly, so they may not be making a direct monetary payment, but someone is paying for it. And sometimes what we see is that by distorting that, by removing that price signal and the incentives that those price signals generate, sometimes we wind up with really perverse consequences that ultimately we prefer less than what we would see if we just actually let people pay what the market price would be for a particular good or service.
Why is it important to see prices as a signal rather than something arbitrary set up by the business elite?
So prices are about the coolest thing that I can possibly think of. And I tell my students when we get to this particular point in the semester that I will nerd out about prices all day long. So there's a principles textbook, so by two economists, Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok. They're both at George Mason University. And the way that they phrase it is this: a price is a signal wrapped in an incentive. So what do they mean by that? Because it's a little convoluted, at least when you say it at first. So when you think about prices, I want to take an example, or if you'll indulge me with an example. Imagine that you walk into a grocery store and you see the apples are out there. And apples were maybe $1 a pound the week before, and now for whatever reason, they're $4 a pound. So think about what happens from the perspective of the buyer and the perspective of the seller. So you walk into the grocery store, you see, oof, apples are really expensive. They weren't this price last week. So think about that. So you've gotten some signal there. The value of apples has gone up. How do you know that? Because you see that the price has increased. So that's the signal. The signal is, hey, apples are more valuable than they were last week. And then what do? As a consumer, you see that higher price and you say, I'm not going to buy as many apples this week. Maybe, in fact, I'm not going to buy any apples at all. So you then have the incentive as a consumer from seeing that higher price to conserve on your consumption. So maybe apples aren't that valuable to you. You're not going to buy any. But that person who really, really loves apples, who values them very highly, they're still going to fork over the cash. They're going to buy some apples. So that's on the demand side of the market. Go over to the supply side, or the producer side of the market. Producers now see, hey, the price of apples has gone up. So again, it's the same signal. Apples are more valuable than they were before. But think now about what incentive does this supplier have? They now have this big incentive to try to get more apples out the door. Why? Because they have a bigger payday. So they have an incentive to produce more apples. Note, by the way, that as our consumers are conserving and our producers are producing more, this is working to coordinate the two groups of individuals so that their expectations link up with one another. So this is like that working conceptualization of going toward equilibrium. So the price signal in that example, and in any other type of example we can think of, the price is what's doing the work. So that, if we think about it, is pretty mind-blowing. But the even cooler part is this. When you walk into the grocery store and you see that the price of apples has gone from $1 to $4, you don't have to have any clue at all about the market for apples. What caused the price to increase? Is it that suddenly everybody wants to buy apples and that's pushed the price up? Is it that there was some kind of a crop failure and that reduced the supply and that pushed the price up? You don't know. The supplier doesn't necessarily have to know either. The cool thing is that even though you have no knowledge whatsoever about the market for apples, you still are able to respond appropriately to what's happening in that market on the basis of this one particular data point, which is the price. That was a really long-winded answer to explain why prices are so cool.
That's an excellent answer. Let's say I look at a number of people who don't have enough money. Therefore, what we need is not necessarily forced redistribution, but obviously we need tons of that too, because that's always terrific. What we could have is one group monopolize the currency, the Federal Reserve, and then they don't even have to print it. They could digitally insert numbers into our bank accounts, loosely referred to as modern monetary theory, under the form of a universal basic income. What are the secondary effects of this that one should be worried about? Because it seems like a very, very cool idea.
So the short version, or the short answer to that question that I would offer, is that there are some really compelling arguments, I think, on both sides of the UBI coin. So I think that from the perspective of, if you were to mandate something like a universal basic income and then to end all other types of social programs, that this might be it may be beneficial on net in the fact, or in this conceptualization, and like in terms of how much we spend on particular policies. Like, it might be cheaper and more efficient to do a UBI as opposed to all of the programs that we have now. So that's on one side. On the other side of that equation, however, think the likelihood that you would have a universal basic income and then get rid of or reduce a variety of other programs, like transfer programs, the chances of that happening are, I'm going to say non-existent, that would probably occur. And so those are kind of the ways that I think about it, but I'm admittedly not particularly up to speed on the debate as it relates to UBI. But those are kinds of the ways that I could think about it, that potentially, if implemented in a way that was perfect, you could see this coming out, again, potentially being beneficial in that it would reduce the scale and scope of government, reduce the cost of government. However, highly skeptical that it would actually work out that way in reality, and would likely just become kind of another item in the laundry list of programs.
How about the idea that printing more money or increasing the number in everyone's bank account will correlate directly to an increase in overall wealth?
So that ignores the fact that inflation is a thing. So one of the things that we look at and we talk about in principles, again, to go back to Milton Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So when we talk about inflation, and right now this is a really big topic because people are talking about inflation. Oh, it's transitory. And there are certain basic models, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that we teach in macro principles, that we can use to explain kind of how it is that these price levels, so inflation, move up and move down. So changes in resource prices, for instance, can move our price level. But when we talk about consistent inflation, this is coming from the government printing money. So one of the best examples that I have of this, and it's, to be fair, not always a really easy concept for people to understand, and people who otherwise are really up to speed on stuff will still sometimes, after hearing people talk about inflation, they'll say, well, I just don't understand why we just can't give everybody more money. Why can't they just print more? And this fails to understand the idea that when we print more money, it doesn't mean that prices stay the same. So those prices are also going to increase if we were to print more money. So a way to think about it is this. If you're somebody who's selling cars, and let's say that you're selling moderately priced cars, so something like $20,000 for a new car, and all of a sudden, everybody tomorrow gets $1 million in their bank account. Are you still going to charge $20,000 for that car? No, because you now know that $20,000, that doesn't really reflect the value of that car. You're going to increase your prices. And so if we were to just print a lot of money, we would see that the prices for all kinds of things would drift up. So not just cars, but also food and entertainment and all other kinds of things that we could think about as well.
How about things like rent control, or the new term, canceling rent? If I'm looking at a number of people in vulnerable positions, in the COVID-19 era especially, I might say, how great would a moratorium by the CDC be? This way, instead of people being kicked out and being homeless, people have a place to live. What are the secondary effects of such a policy?
They're not good. So I've actually written quite a bit on the eviction moratorium. Just had a piece that came out a couple of weeks ago about this particular topic. So if people are not particularly familiar, the CDC under the Trump administration issued an eviction moratorium, which basically prevents people from being evicted from someone else's property for non-payment of rent if they can demonstrate that they suffered hardship through COVID-19, and then there are their bookends, their income parameters on that as well. This has been extended a couple of times. It was allowed to expire very briefly a few weeks ago, and then the CDC, at the behest of the Biden administration, issued a quote unquote new moratorium that's targeted, again, target in air quotes, toward places that are seeing a high rate of transmission, which at this point covers basically the entirety of the United States. So this idea on its face sounds good. And to be sure, I think I probably speak for most people when I say nobody likes the idea of lots and lots of people suddenly becoming homeless. And we certainly know that there are lots of people who, as a direct result of the pandemic, are in really dire financial straits. They've lost jobs, they've not been able to maybe recoup their losses, and so on. There are a couple of problems with the eviction moratorium. So the first question is not so much an economic one, but one of legality. So there's a question, for instance, related to the constitutionality of the eviction moratorium. The federal government is tasked with interstate commerce, not intrastate commerce. And by all accounts, the vast majority of rental agreements are those intrastate. So there's that question. Also, if we set that aside, in terms of legality, the CDC does not have the authority to issue this kind of a mandate. But legality issues aside, what are the economic consequences of this particular policy? So I think there are a few things. So again, going back to our earlier conversation, there's no such thing as free. And this eviction moratorium doesn't let people off the hook for their rent. It just means they don't have to pay it right now. So if you have something like an $800 a month apartment and you haven't paid it for, say, a year, and the eviction moratorium gets lifted, you're still on the hook for almost 10 grand in rent. Now, most Americans don't have $400 to meet an unexpected expense, much less be able to write a check for almost 10 grand and call it good. So you're going to see at the end of this policy, I think, because at some point the bill is going to come due, you are going to see a large number of evictions. Those evictions are going to have effects for renters down the road as they go and they try to rent apartments, because an eviction on your rental record is bad news if you go to try to rent later. But it's even more serious than that. So when we look at the eviction moratorium, one group that's constantly left out of the discussion are landlords. And contrary to popular belief, about half of all landlords in this country are individuals. And a substantial portion of those are what we call mom and pop landlords. So they have one, maybe two rentals. They're older couples who maybe paid off their mortgage on their original house. Their kids moved out, now they've downsized, but they're still keeping their other properties like a means of supplementing their income and so on. So you have these individuals who are renting out their property, and now they're not getting in that income. But their costs haven't stopped. So they still have to pay mortgages, insurance, taxes, upkeep cost, and so on. So it's not difficult to see how this could then lead to something like a lot of foreclosures on houses when landlords aren't able to pay. So that's the second problem. Third problem, people, landlords, are likely to decide, you know what, forget it. I'm not going to rent my property. Instead, I'm going to just sell it outright. Or maybe I'm going to use it. So we also anticipate that on the back end of this moratorium, you're likely to see a decrease in the supply of housing, which exacerbates an existing housing shortage. And then the last problem, or one, it's probably not the last problem, but the last one that I'll talk about because I'm going too long already, is that when we think about future renting, what is that going to look like? So if you're a landlord and you're someone who decides that you still want to rent your property, who are you going to rent to? And what are you going to do to try to hedge your bets? Because now you've just had this experience where for over a year, government has said, hey, somebody else can live in your property and doesn't have to pay you one time and you can't evict them. So what you're going to do is you're going to really scrupulously screen your renters. You're going to charge higher rents, and you're going to do things like require heavier security deposits. So instead of say 1 month's rent as a security deposit and you're good to go, now you got to pay me 3 months rent in terms of the security deposit. Because if I'm a landlord, I want to be able to hedge my bets. I'm going to want to rent to people who I think are going to be able to pay me in the event that government does something like this again. And so the people who are ultimately going to really lose out on this type of policy are the people who are least able to afford to move into an apartment that's now maybe $500 more expensive, and you have to be sitting on a major cash cushion in order to be able to get in the door in the first place.
Yeah, Mises would always talk about how one regulation would have a number of negative effects. And then statists, socialists, neocons, would then use those negative effects as reasons for more government intervention, which would have negative effects, which they would then use as justifications for further intervention. And gosh, he had the perfect line. It's something like, the initial regulation is the first step to eventual socialism or something, because at no point, if you recognize the state's right to coercively involve themselves in a voluntary interaction, well, then it's just another mechanism for achieving your ends. And in every interaction, there's always a shortcoming on one side or another. So you just keep using this tool again and again and again until, until the state more or less owns the property outright. Do you see that there is a way that people sort of look at the world, sort of a philosophy of how producers, the people offering me products, offering me services, offering me a job, that's evil exploitation. But the people who want to take 50% of my income and cage me for not chipping into wars based on lies, those are my representatives. I need to pledge my allegiance to them. How is it that such a scam is able to be perpetrated on a first world country?
So there's a lot to potentially think about there. So I love that chapter that you're talking about in Human Action, where Mises talks about specifically the dynamics of intervention. And the dynamics that he lays out are exactly what you point out, which is that, and he talks about this certainly elsewhere as well. He talks about he talks about that in a few different places, these dynamics of intervention, but it gets laid out in more detail in some places than others. So this idea that you implement an intervention in one place, and then you see that this intervention either fails outright or potentially leads to other issues in other areas. And so then what decisions do you face as the interventionist? You can either withdraw that intervention, which, note, from like a political perspective, means that you have to admit failure and defeat and that you were wrong, and then you pick up your ball and go home. Or you can effectively double down. And you can say, oh no, more intervention. Politically, how do we see this? It's frequently couched in the thing of like, oh, well, we didn't have enough time, we didn't have enough personnel, we didn't have enough money. Therefore, you should give us more personnel, more money, and more time in order to do this thing. And then it kind of goes from there. So that's one piece. But the question of how has this idea that the people who are the makers or the producers are the people who are to be vilified in some capacity, whereas the people who are attempting to forcibly take wealth from others and give it to other people are people who are to be lauded and respected. It's not a way of thinking that appeals to me in the slightest, but obviously it is an argument that has an immense amount of appeal. I don't really know where exactly that idea comes from, other than the fact that and this is not an economic explanation necessarily, I think it sounds really good, this idea that here is someone who is offering to fix all of these social problems in a way that seems relatively easy and straightforward. This really fails to appreciate the constraints on human reason. So what F.A. Hayek called the knowledge problem, and certainly Mises is thought about within that context as well. So it fails to appreciate those constraints, but then also really fails to appreciate the political constraints. So along the lines of the economist James Buchanan and this public choice school that comes out of his work, it really fails to appreciate a lot of constraints. There's actually an op-ed that I wrote with a fellow economist of mine named Dave Hebert. I believe the title of it was something like "A World Without Billionaires Would Be Brutal," where we take the unpopular position of defending the work of billionaires, people like Jeff Bezos, for instance, and basically saying that we should be really grateful for them because a world without them would be it wouldn't be as good as the one that we have now. As you can imagine, we may have gotten some interesting feedback on that one.
Yeah, the $5 trillion the Fed steal annually, they just need a couple more billion, and then they'll be totally satisfied. I mean, I've seen those stats a dozen times where it's like, if you take all the money of all the billionaires, it would fund the feds for 1 year. But that doesn't even take into account that they'd see, hey, tons more money. We just came up with a large number of new projects. I hate giving them any wiggle room. I think Brian Kaplan calls it yielding the field to social desirability bias, where it's like, oof. All right, once we give them the recognition that, yeah, it's totally cool that this party coercively involves itself on behalf of anyone else. Well, anytime we're against that, well, then we're against the poor. Then we obviously don't care if people are homeless. We don't care about the uneducated if we ever want to constrain this organization. So when we face when we face something like all government programs, there's two types: ones that work and ones that need more funding. How can we ever address these on economic principle? Of course, I talk a lot about the state being coercive. So let's say philosophically, it's already illegitimate. But economically, how can we look at something and say, you know what, this is falsifiable? You can't just always say we need more funding and we always need more education to improve all these other things. How can we falsify the idea that it's always justified for one group to coercively interfere on behalf of one party or another?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that I've spoken about in other areas is how to talk to people who disagree with you when it comes to these types of issues. And so there's that question in terms of addressing, I think, what you refer to as really the philosophical underpinnings of these types of issues. But then there's the practical element of how do you go about convincing people that, hey, these policies aren't great. So there's a couple things within that, but I'll start there. So I think that people are actually more willing to accept that certain programs don't work when presented with the data. So one of the things that I do with my principal students, for instance, on the very first day of class, is we talk about airline regulation. In particular, we talk about the fact that you don't have to put a child under the age of 2 in a car seat, even though we know that that is statistically more dangerous than holding a kid on your lap. And we talk about why it is that economists have pushed back against several really intensive efforts to mandate that car seats be mandated for on airlines for children who are really young. And the reason that that's pushed back against is because if you have to have a car seat for a kid on an airplane, that makes flying more expensive. So then parents with young children are more likely to drive. Driving is a lot more dangerous than flying. So if your goal is really to keep children safe, then the status quo is actually better. And when you talk people through that, you go from having them look at you like you are a terrible person to having them think like, okay, like actually this sounds really reasonable. So I think that people can be persuaded. One of the ways that I think is particularly effective is if you try to meet people where they are. So when we talk about issues like poverty, for instance, you come from a place of like, look, I am also concerned about people who are poor. But let me explain to you why I think that this particular policy is either achieving this particular goal that we want it to achieve or doesn't achieve that particular goal. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of times we're working toward the same goals or we're interested in the same ends as people who are our ideological opposites. We just have very, very different ways of thinking about how we go about achieving this particular goals. So I think that meeting people where they are in terms of what they want and then illustrating kind of your way of thinking and providing evidence is helpful in convincing people, hey, this policy is working or this policy is not working. So that's one thing. Now, how you then turn the tide to try to get these policies to be attenuated or otherwise undone, that is a completely different question in and of itself. Because then you have to start thinking about the political process through which these types of policies are made. And putting the genie back in the bottle once it's been let open is a difficult and still frankly open question. And one that I've tackled a lot in looking at things related to foreign policy, domestic civil liberty issues, and so on, is that even if people recognize and people are no longer amenable to these types of policies, so think about something like the war on terror or the war on drugs, like big picture items, even if people withdraw their support for those types of policies, you now have decades of bureaucratic entrenchment of policies that have been rolled out. And so you have to then start dismantling and disrupting all of those different government institutions and individuals involved with those institutions. And that's a really tall order. So I don't know that there's anything particularly concrete about how it is that we go about doing that. Other than to say that we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. And so when we're talking about policy changes, and I think people who are particularly amenable to or interested in things like freedom and civil liberties fall prey to this in particular. I know sometimes I do. We want, what we want and what is practically achievable in the short and intermediate term are two very, very different things. And so we have to be willing to accept, and we should celebrate marginal steps in the right direction.
What is the thesis of your book, Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism?
So in Tyranny, my co-author, Chris Coyne, and I, we talk about the implications of foreign intervention on domestic institutions. So oftentimes when people talk about foreign and domestic policy, they think about foreign policy is occurring over here, domestic policy is over here, and these two things don't go together. But what we try to point out is that you cannot have that kind of a clean divorce, and these things do bleed into each other. And so what we do is we talk about how when a government acting outside of its own geographic territory is able to engage in types of social control techniques that otherwise they might not be able to at home. And then we develop a framework for understanding how it is that those tools, techniques, and attitudes come to be used domestically. So we apply that framework to things like surveillance, to police militarization, to the use of torture, and so on.
And isn't that the great switcheroo, that they're only having the NSA spy on the terrorists, and Abu Ghraib is only going to be used for the worst of the worst. Meanwhile, Edward Snowden and William Benny released that they're actually spying on everyone, and we're all more or less like, all right, if you could knock that off, I'd appreciate it. But if not, I guess we'll just talk about the 3% difference in your tax policies.
We do talk about whistleblowers in that book. We also talk about it in our second book. We also have a third paper with economist named Nathan Goodman. So he's recently finished at George Mason. He's going to be starting a postdoc at NYU up here in a few weeks, which is specifically on the economics of the political economy of whistleblowers. And so we definitely place an important emphasis on things like, Snowden you mentioned, but also Daniel Hale, who was in the news like very recently. They play an important role in checking government.
Now, Barack Obama, I remember I was a big supporter at the time. He had said something that makes perfect sense. I just heard it at the airport. If you see something, say something. Because if you have nothing to hide, then hide nothing. So this is very simple. So what is wrong with a police state at home? So long as you're obeying the laws and edicts of your representatives, you really have nothing to worry about, whether there's 10 million policemen or it's just Andy Griffith and his sheriff that has one bullet at a time. Okay, I'm sorry to derail that. Why should I fear a police state if I'm a good, law-abiding person?
So there's actually a forthcoming paper that's coming out, which has really great arguments related to this. So it's Chris Coyne and then a co-author who I'm kicking myself for not remembering, which is actually titled Police State USA. I don't know if people Google it, if they have a working version up or not, but it addresses some of the critical consequences of a police state. Chris and I in Tyranny talk about the consequences of things like surveillance, of police militarization, of the use of torture within a domestic context. And frankly, it's an absolute disaster from a civil liberties perspective. Now, you mentioned, though, that for a lot of people, the attitude is, well, I have nothing to hide and therefore I don't care. And if that really is the attitude that people hold, then we frankly have already kind of lost the battle there, because that, like I said, if that's the attitude, then people are okay with it. One of the things, though, that I think is important for us to bring up in any types of these discussions is that typically when people think about security and liberty, they think about it as like a trade-off. So this idea that, well, we trade off a little bit of liberty for a little bit more security, and vice versa, that if we reduced our security, we could have a little bit more liberty. But this trade-off is way, way, way too simplistic. And it fails to capture the fact that a lot of times when we're talking about security policy, these policies not only fail to make us safer, but also effectively reduce our liberties. The See Something, Say Something program that you just brought up is actually a prime example. So See Something, Say Something doesn't really do anything to effectively keep us safer. Why? Because people don't know what they're looking for. You're not a security expert. I'm saying you in like a general sense. Maybe you are a security expert. I wouldn't know, for instance, like people don't know the difference between like, what's a bomb and somebody who just like left a backpack. Like they can't tell the difference. And so what you wind up with is hundreds of people calling the, New York subway system to report suspicious packages, diverting the attention of law enforcement to a bunch of ridiculous nonsense as opposed to focusing on things which might actually warrant attention. That doesn't help in terms of security and safety. It does make people really afraid. It does bloat this, security state apparatus that we were talking about. But it also very much effectively erodes our liberty. Think about like when you travel with the TSA. Again, despite the narrative, the TSA doesn't really do anything to keep you safe. It is security theater in its truest form. But it absolutely violates your civil liberties without having any kind of a corresponding increase in safety. So I think there are a couple things that we could talk about there. But again, if people's attitude is seriously that, well, I have nothing to hide and I don't care, and you shouldn't care either, then that's a different problem.
It's always nice to just play their own game with them, be like, oh yeah, you got nothing to hide and you'll be great, but only under Trump. It's this evil Biden guy. This guy's his military. He's going to really impose his will on you. And then you just turn around and say the same exact thing. Well, if this DeSantis guy ever gets in there, well, then we're basically finished. So let's just sort of call it a truce, more or less. Just play the sides off against each other.
When I teach public choice, one of the first things that we start off with is we talk about the arguments for why a state is necessary. And we also talk about kind of the precursors to discussing public choice. And one of those things is this Humean idea of, when we think about the person in charge making policy, do not assume a benevolent, omniscient, like angelic figure. Instead, assume the knave. Or if we want to modernize that, as opposed to your favorite politician being in charge, make the rules assuming the politician you hate the most is the person who is going to be in charge. And that's the way that you should construct the rules that are going to constrain your government. And when you phrase it like that, people seem to get it a lot more. Of like, the assumption should not be that we have the best circumstances. The assumption should be, hey, assume that the person that you can't stand the most is going to be wielding the power, and then go from there.
Exactly. Yeah, that they have all these brilliant criticisms of market failure, and there's greed, and there's dog-eat-dog competition. Meanwhile, all of those apply to the political sector as well, which you don't have the recognized right to opt out of, which makes it worse than anything in the voluntary sector. I just want to ask you two more questions. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. You wrote a book, Manufacturing Militarism, U.S. Government Propaganda in the War on Terror. What is your thesis of that book?
So this book just very recently came out earlier this month. And in that book, again, same co-author, so Chris Coyne and I argue that democracies, particularly within the realm of the defense and security arena, have characteristics that make them particularly susceptible to propaganda. So what we do is we outline what it is within a democratic society that makes it susceptible to propaganda, talk about why the security state exacerbates these particular issues, and then we apply this framework to understand how it is that propaganda in the war on terror has been created and disseminated. So in particular, how it's been used to garner support for particular conflicts. So namely like the war on terror generally, but more specifically, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, but then also how it is that propaganda is used to foster this broader culture of militarism. So we talk about things like the use of propaganda in sports, the use of propaganda in film, and so on.
And what is the most important thing you learned from the work of Walter E. Williams?
Oh gosh, so much. So I had the great pleasure of taking a class from Dr. Williams when I was a first-year Ph.D. student at George Mason. And I can't emphasize enough how you just knew when you were sitting in his classroom that you were receiving a lesson from just this economic titan. Very much a student of UCLA price theory, and I owe him an immense debt for imparting that UCLA price theory to me. In terms of maybe one of the most important things that I learned from him is how to, without fear, articulate what it is that economics has taught you and what it is that the economics is telling you. Because God knows that what Dr. Williams said was not always popular, but he certainly was very forthright in, you cannot like what it's saying all you want, but this is what the economics tells us. And so I'm immensely thankful to him for imparting that lesson.
Well, thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Links to everything we discussed about Dr. Hall will be in the description below. Dr. Hall, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Keith. It was great.